Hello, my name is Piers Rawling. I'm in the philosophy department at Florida State University, and I'm going to read my paper, Davidson on Indeterminacy and Passing Theories, Need Translators Worry? However, a copy of this is posted on the conference website, so you might simply prefer to read it there rather than listen to me. But anyhow, here goes. Here are a pair of quotations that might perhaps disconcert practicing translators. The first is from Donald Davidson. In linguistic communication, nothing corresponds to a linguistic competence, as often described. I conclude that there is no such thing as a language, not if a language is anything like what many philosophers and linguists have supposed. There is therefore no such thing to be learned, mastered, or born with. We must give up the idea of a clearly defined shared structure which language users acquire and then apply to cases. And we should try again to say how convention in any important sense is involved in language. Or, as I think, we should give up the attempt to illuminate how we communicate by appeal to conventions. The second quote is from W.V.O. Quine. Language is a social art. In acquiring it, we have to depend entirely on intersubjectively available cues as to what to say and when. Hence, there is no justification for collating linguistic meanings, unless in terms of men's dispositions to respond overtly to so socially observable stimulations. An effect of recognizing this limitation is that the enterprise of translation is found to be involved in a certain systematic indeterminacy. Davidson concurs. In what follows, I shall argue that conventions are key to interpretation and that its indeterminacy is not so radical that translators need be concerned about it. Davidson prefers the term interpretation to translation since he sees an understanding of the interpretee's mental states as crucial if we are to understand her words. Davidson's argument against conventions begins with the idea that we must stand ready at any point in a conversation to revise our ongoing interpretation of our interlocutor. Davidson is impressed in this regard with our ability to understand malaprops. We can, of course, do the same with slips of the tongue, typos, and all manner of variations on usage. One lesson Davidson draws from this is that our ability to interpret each other relies upon our skillful application of the principle of charity to the evidence provided by the speaker as to what she means, where the principle of charity requires us to make the best sense possible of one another. More on this later. In particular, communication requires neither linguistic competence nor conventions. Davidson's picture is as follows. Speaker and hearer enter into a conversation with certain expectations. Hearer has what Davidson refers to as an implicit prior theory as to how to interpret speaker. Speaker has largely implicit beliefs about the content of hearer's prior theory of her. Speaker intends to be understood as, say, asserting that the cat is on the mat. So she tailors her assertion in light of what she takes to be hearer's prior theory, so as to convey to hearer, she hopes, that the cat is on the mat. But of course, speaker can get things wrong. She might have false belief about hearer's prior theory, or her tongue might slip. In which case, hearer has to modify her prior theory in light of the new evidence to yield what Davidson calls a passing theory concerning speaker's usage. The idea is that we are constructing passing theories all the time in our conversational interactions, and they are so fleeting that a, quote, passing theory is not a theory of what anyone, except perhaps a philosopher, would call an actual natural language. Mastery of such a language would be useless, since knowing a passing theory is only knowing how to interpret a particular utterance on a particular occasion. Nor could such a language, if we want to call it that, be said to have been learned or to be governed by conventions. Of course, things previously learned were essential to arriving at the passing theory, but what was learned could not have been the passing theory. Note that Davidson is not merely arguing that communication is possible between interlocutors who, while speaking different languages, understand both. Both parties might understand both French and Spanish, while one utters only French and the other only Spanish. Rather, he's arguing that there are no such languages as French and Spanish. No such languages as French or Spanish, apologies. And the proposal is more radical than the claim that there are different dialects of these languages. Indeed, he denies there is even such a thing as an idiolect, if by that we mean a unique language spoken by only one individual. Idiolects would have conventions. at the least, there would be consistent linguistic usage. Davidson's thought is not that usage might go off the rails, but rather that there are no rails to begin with. There are shades of Wittgenstein on rule following here, but that would take me too far off topic. But now the question arises, what are the, quote, things previously learned that are essential to arriving at the passing theory that Davidson cites? I am an Englishman living in Florida, but I have learned enough about the locals to know the conventions of their usage, and these are essential when it comes to my interpreting them. There is no doubt that they might defy my expectations on occasion, but just because I have to adjust my interpretation of them in light of their departure from my expectations doesn't entail that neither of us has an idiolect. I have mine, each of them theirs. We can make mistakes by our own lights, of course, but this doesn't mean that there is not enough consistency to warrant ascribing idiolects that persist over time. Mrs. Malaprop is fictional, but we have plenty of real-life examples. In the US, we have George W. Bushisms, quote, "It will take time to restore chaos and order," close quote. And prior to him, we had Dan Quayle, quote, "Republicans understand the importance of bondage between a mother and child," close quote. In the case of Bush's use of chaos, it may be a slip of the tongue. However, perhaps in Quayle's idiolect, bondage has a different meaning than in mine. But English speakers can easily understand what both men are trying to say on the basis of context and shared usage. In neither case does it require that we assign different idiolects with each passing utterance. Bush might share my idiolect when it comes to his utterance, but have made a slip. Quayle might have a different idiolect, but a constant one, his own set of conventions. In the case of slips of the tongue, interpretation requires a background of convention. Slips wouldn't be slips otherwise. In the case of Quayle, the relation of bondage to bond in the conventions of English is key to unlocking his intended meaning. And in both cases, of course, the humor would be missed without appeal to these conventions. It is certainly true that we must often adjust our interpretations as we go along, but in the absence of errors on the part of the speaker, I would contend that this is just part of the process of working out her relatively constant linguistic conventions, rather than ascribing meanings in accord with a passing theory. But what happens in the case where we are starting from scratch with no shared background of common usage? This is the circumstance of the radical interpreter. Suppose you find yourself stranded on a desert island with one fellow castaway with whom you cannot initially communicate. You must each then build your interpretations of one another from the ground up. We know this is possible, but Davidson asks, how? He pursues the answer by laying down criteria that interpretation must meet. In order for interaction to be mutual interpretation, the parties must make assumptions about each other, assumptions that could not turn out to be false, lest their enterprise fail to be interpretation. In this sense, then, no interpretation is built entirely from nothing, and it is this that helps make radical interpretation possible. The ineliminable assumptions we must make in limiting what counts as interpretation provide a structure without which radical interpretation would be impossible. What are these assumptions? Neil Wilson coined the term principle of charity to name the following principle. We select as designatum that individual which will make the largest possible number of statements true. Quine appeals to this idea in formulating a key maxim of translation. Assertions startlingly false on the face of them are likely to turn on hidden differences of language. This maxim is strong enough in all of us to swerve us even from the homophonic method that is so fundamental to the very acquisition and use of the mother tongue. The common sense behind the maxim is that one's interlocutor's silliness, beyond a certain point, is less likely than bad translation, or, in the domestic case, linguistic divergence. A crucial form of silliness for Quine is the flouting of logic. Fair translation preserves logical laws. To call this charity is, of course, an intentional misnomer. To be uncharitable is to disengage from the practice of translation. Davidson goes beyond Quine in applying, quote, the principle of charity across the board, close quote, concluding that what makes interpretation possible is, quote, the structure of the normative character of thought, desire, speech, and action imposes on correct attributions of attitudes to others, and hence on interpretations of their speech and explanations of their actions. And Davidson also goes beyond Quine, it seems, in rejecting the notion of a mother tongue. Davidson then seeks to solve the puzzle of how it is possible to attribute meanings and other propositional attitudes, beliefs and desires and their ilk, when observable behavior is our only evidence. Part of his solution is that we are constrained by the principle of charity. But are there further assumptions we must make about our interpretee? Consider our pair of radical interpreters trying to establish lines of communication. Among other things, they might point to various objects and make accompanying utterances. It would take time to pin down what even simple words refer to, but clearly, if success is to be achieved, each interlocutor must be consistent in her usage. Neither need use her mother tongue, of course, but they must start to establish conventions. Each of our interpreters could even, for amusement, purposely muddle her native dialect or make up a new one. But provided each muddles consistently, no damage would be done to the prospects for communication. Thus, despite what might initially appear to be the possibility of communication without them, conventions are as crucial as the presumptions of the principle of charity. I turn now to the other potentially disconcerting claim, that interpretation is indeterminate. Davidson and Quine actually make two distinct claims about indeterminacy. The first is that interpretation is epistemically indeterminate. Whatever evidence we have, there will be more than one interpretation that accounts for the relevant data. And this epistemic indeterminacy is not, it is claimed, contingent upon the fact that our evidence is limited to what we have so far observed. Even if, per impossibile, we knew how our interpretee would behave under all possible circumstances, the claim is that our knowledge would still underdetermine interpretation. As Quine puts it, quote, translation is indeterminate in principle relative to the totality of speech dispositions. Thus, even in the observational limit, as it were, there will be many competing yet adequate interpretations of a given interpretee. The second claim is based on what we might call the manifestation principle. Quote, meaning is entirely determined by observable behavior, even readily observable behavior. So says Davidson. Thus, if observable behavior does not determine unique interpretations, as per epistemic indeterminacy, then meaning is metaphysically indeterminate. There are no facts to be known regarding what the interpretee means by her words. And these indeterminacies extend to thought. Quote, the evidence on which all these matters depend gives us no way of separating out the contributions of thought, action, desire, and meaning one by one. Total theories are what we must construct, and many theories will do equally well. Meaning and the propositional attitudes are interdependent. To attribute a meaning to an utterance is to attribute a propositional attitude that it expresses. Thus, Davidson appeals to a general form of the manifestation principle. There can be nothing more to meanings and the propositional attitudes than the potentially observable phenomena provide. And hence, on his view, there appear to be no facts of the matter concerning what we mean by many of our words, nor the contents of many of our propositional attitudes. And thus it seems that Davidson must renounce the attitudes, since they are individuated by their contents. What distinguishes the belief that grass is green from the belief that snow is white is that the first has the content that grass is green, whereas the second has the content that snow is white. But amongst many other difficulties, such as the fact that we couldn't believe the theory he is propounding, Davidson's abandoning the propositional attitudes undercuts radical interpretation. Radical interpretation requires charity, and charity requires the existence of beliefs. Not only must the interpretee have beliefs, but they must rationally cohere, and many of them must be true. Furthermore, even in his rejection of conventions, Davidson maintains that communicative utterances have first meanings, as opposed to further implications that the speaker intends his hearer to grasp. And these are given by certain intentions of the speaker. But as I see matters, he is in the position of denying the existence of propositional attitudes, including intentions, unless there are no first or any other meanings. Avoiding this conclusion requires either that the interpreter's data make manifest a unique interpretation or rejection of the manifestation principle. Davidson, however, claims that the multiplicity of interpretations is no more problematic than, say, the multiplicity of scales of length measurements. Interpretation is analogous to measurement. The basic idea of Davidson's analogical strategy is clear enough. We use sentences to track the propositional attitudes of an agent. They give the content of the attitudes. We use the real numbers to track, say, the lengths of objects. The sentence in the former attribution plays the role of the real numbers in the latter. We might maintain that there is an indeterminacy of length. There are infinitely many serviceable schemes for attributing lengths, feet, inches, meters, etc., and we could come up with infinitely many more. Similarly, there are many serviceable schemes for attributing meanings and the other attitudes to a given interpretee, or so Davidson claims. And the latter indeterminacy, Davidson claims, is as benign as the former. But the details of the analogy need spelling out. And I have argued elsewhere that it does not go through. The basic problem is that when measuring length, we do not identify the objects being measured by citing their lengths, whereas propositional attitudes are identified in part by their contents. Where does all this leave the practicing translator? Regarding conventions, I have suggested that they are left intact. There are hiccups, of course, and translators have to be at the ready to depart from convention to account for them, so as to make sense of what is being said or written. But the challenge from indeterminacy is that there will be multiple conventions that make equally good sense of the data, and that there is no fact of the matter as to which is correct. However, I am skeptical of both epistemic indeterminacy and the manifestation principle, at least in their global forms. Of course, the spottier the evidence, the more latitude there is for competing translations that fit it. But unless our standards of confirmation are unrealistically high, we have enough evidence in our everyday interactions with people of our own culture to pin things down pretty uniquely when it comes to what we might call the basics about such things as familiar macroscopic objects. And I see no reason to doubt that there are facts of the matter about correct translation at this basic level, even when there is epistemic slack. The manifestation principle does not follow from the mere fact that language is, quote, social, close quote. The case for epistemic indeterminacy is greater when it comes to, say, translation across radically different cultures, of historical texts, or indeed of philosophy. We might find the beliefs of other cultures puzzling. The data concerning historical texts might be very incomplete, and philosophy can be notoriously difficult to comprehend, even when written in one's mother tongue. But I don't see the case for metaphysical indeterminacy as being any stronger, apart from cases in which the speakers or writers themselves are not entirely sure what they mean. This is not to say that translations can always be effective, of course. We might simply lack enough data. And when we do have the data, word-for-word translations will frequently not be possible. Sometimes an essay is required to get the sense of a foreign or unfamiliar word. Finally, if we think of interpretation as in part trying to see inside another person's mind or comprehend their culture, then language is too crude an instrument to accomplish this beyond a certain point. There are all sorts of nuances that language simply cannot capture, but that only renders linguistic interpretation in that sense incomplete. It does not put it beyond the scope of correctness, nor make it incorrect. And I hope that some of you will have questions during the question and answer period during the online conference. And now I am going to cease recording. Cheerio.